Hello everyone, and welcome to Anomalous Archive, where we post scary stories to help you sleep. Please comment where you are listening to my videos from, since I believe it would be fun for all of us to know. Also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's reach 10 subscribers until the end of this month. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. It was early December, and since I had recently turned 21, I had decided that it was time to, so to speak, perform a rite of passage into manhood. After weeks of pestering my parents, my mother, to be honest, they finally gave in to my request to go alone for about 2 weeks to our cabin in the local Rocky Mountains. My family was what you would call nature-loving. We went camping at least 3 times a month, spending entire days hiking, hunting, fishing, or canoeing. My siblings and I had shot, gutted, and eaten more deer and wild boars than we could count. Our freezer was always filled with freshly caught fish. Surviving outside was therefore not a problem for us. But since the death of my uncle, my mother's brother, my mother had been protecting us more and more. Yes, it took some persuasion, but now I was here, driving up a winding road and enjoying the beautiful scenery as I made my ascent. My phone buzzed, a call from my oldest brother. I quickly grabbed it. The deeper I ventured into the mountains, the more likely this would be my last call before I lost reception. "Noah, are you there, buddy?" His voice was already breaking. "I'm here, Oliver." "What's up, man?" "Nothing. I'm just calling to see how you're doing. You are her favorite, and she is worried," he said with a chuckle. That was true. As the youngest, my mother always protected me more than my other siblings. It was nice to be able to hold that over my other siblings, even though the care I received was sometimes a bit excessive. "So far, it's going pretty well," I assured him, "but I'm about to lose reception. I will be offline for about 2 weeks. If I decide to stay for 3 weeks, I will call and let you know." "Sounds good. I'll let you handle that." He laughed. "Don't let anything consume you." I looked at my phone. No reception. Smiling, I tossed it onto the travel bag next to me. I was cut off from the world. These would be 2 great weeks. The first 3 days were uneventful. I hunted, gathered wood, lazed around, and went on all-day hikes, just me and my thoughts. It was truly heavenly. Day 4. Everything went downhill on this day. I had just shot a deer, a buck, mind you, and I don't mean to brag, but it was a big one, by far the biggest I've ever shot. Its antlers had a circumference of 4 feet, and would probably have fed me for most, if not all, of the remaining time I would spend here. But I could in no way carry it back to the cabin, or even drag it. So I began to dismantle it. I leaned my rifle against a tree and got to work. I slit it open, pulled out the entrails and other organs, washed the blood off with a handful of snow, and began cutting it into smaller pieces. I hadn't had breakfast yet, and it was already afternoon. I was quite hungry, so I cut off a decent portion of venison, stuck my knife into the tree above my rifle, and set off back to the cabin. My plan was to slowly roast the meat over the fire while I went back to take care of a bit more of the deer. By the time I returned, it should be done, so I went to the hut, made a fire, and placed the deer on the grill above it. I used the fire to warm myself a bit, and then went back outside. I trudged through the snow and made my way back to the deer. I was about 5 minutes away from the spot when I felt a strange cold. It was naturally cold. The thermometer in the cabin showed minus 21 degrees Fahrenheit. But this was different. It penetrated my well-wrapped body and reached deep into my core. I looked around. I don't know why, but I did it. And then I saw something, a dark figure, about my height, crouching behind a tree about 60 feet away. That didn't generally bother me. This was a public mountain, and it was a beautiful time of year ahead of us. Why shouldn't there be other people up here? "Hey, buddy," I shouted. No answer. "Hey, did you get lost?" Nothing. I called out again, still nothing. Maybe I imagined it, I thought, whether I should go over to examine the tree. But I decided against it. It was cold. In the cabin, food was cooking, and I didn't want anything to get to my deer. Wolves were a problem out here, so I sighed and continued on to the spot where the deer was. When I arrived, the area was immaculate. At first, I thought I had gotten lost or that the deer was in another area. But no, there was my knife, still wedged in the tree, right above my rifle. I went over, yanked my knife out, and took my rifle. A glimmer caught my eye. I looked at my knife. It was flawless. I had left the knife just as it was, covered in blood and bits of flesh when I had stuck it in the tree. But now it was incredibly clean. Even the tip with which I had stuck it in the tree was shiny and clean. I turned around. There was nothing. There was literally nothing. When I left, the floor was covered with blood, pieces of flesh, intestines lying around, and, most notably, a deer. But now there was nothing left. The floor was impeccably white. It looked as if nothing had ever been there. Not even footprints, neither from the perpetrator nor from me, as I suddenly realized. The snow looked untouched. The only footprints were the ones I had just made. I lifted my foot and set it down again. With an icy crunch, it sank into the snow. The snow was old, very old, I knew that. It hadn't snowed in the 4 days I had been there. Every crunch of my boots reminded me of that. So there was no logical explanation for why there were no footprints in the snow anymore, or anything at all in the snow. A whole slaughterhouse just vanished. Every piece of meat and every drop of blood within 20 minutes. I stumbled backward, turned around, and ran all the way back to the cabin. I had at least expected to smell the scent of cooked game again. That too had disappeared. That evening, I went to bed early. The next day, today, everything was over. The events of the previous day had shaken me, but this was different. I had spent the whole day indoors. Our cabin was, unlike most others, solar-powered, and we had working lamps, a refrigerator, and a stove. However, my father had refused to install heating and instead only installed a large fireplace in the living room and 2 smaller ones in the bedrooms because he believed it would ruin the camping experience, as if the work lights and the sanitary facilities hadn't already done that. But that was really fine with us. The cabin was medium-sized and had only 2 bedrooms, a larger one for my 2 brothers, my father, and me, and a smaller one for my mother and my sister. In addition, there was a small bathroom, a small kitchen, since we had decided to prepare most of our meals outside anyway, and a small living room. It wasn't difficult to keep the cabin warm even on the coldest days, especially because I simply closed the bedroom doors to keep the heat in the main part of the cabin. So it wasn't unpleasant to stay inside. I spent the day writing, sleeping, and reading. I also cooked a few frozen hot dogs, which my father insisted we keep in the cabin as a supply. It was a good day, and the bizarre events of the previous day quickly faded from memory. I still couldn't explain why it had happened, but I didn't care. So I dismissed it as a strange natural phenomenon. Some hungry wolves had dragged it away and licked up all the remaining traces of blood and entrails, even from my knife. And as for the footprints and the figure behind the tree, I didn't know, and it wasn't particularly important to me at that moment, as I had noticed that the fire had gone out again. Anyway, I had spent the day replenishing it with a small pile of what we kept in the house. Suddenly, I felt the same strange cold as yesterday. This time, I attributed it to the dying fire that let the cold into the air. I took a look outside. It was already 8 p.m. and pitch dark. Fortunately, I had stacked a nice pile of wood right next to the side of the house, so I didn't have to go into my area and chop some wood. I put on my jacket, but the cold remained. I opened the door and turned on the outside light, as the small sliver of moon hanging above me did little to illuminate my surroundings. Where was a full moon when you needed one? I went down the steps and approached the side of the cabin where the woodpile was, and my boots crunched loudly in the snow. I turned the corner and came across nothing. The wood was gone. Not a single piece of wood was left. Even in low light, I could see it as if there had never been any. I turned towards the forest. At that moment, I was scared and angry. We had no neighbors, not for at least 4 kilometers, and even he was a half-senile old man named Alfred, the kind of man who took expert marksmen into the woods for fun or made his own moonshine. I turned back towards the forest and watched him tensely. Herb was hard of hearing, but he was friendly and could chop his own wood. He wouldn't do that, and probably couldn't do it at his age either. So who was it? I looked down. Again, no footprints. I needed more wood. It was too cold to spend the night without a fire. I was just about to turn around and go back when a branch in the forest snapped and sounded like a gunshot. So I looked around and listened carefully. I stood there for about 5 minutes. From the dark forest, no sound could be heard anymore. I slowly walked backward and continued towards the cabin. Back inside, I got dressed and made myself comfortable on the sofa. First thing tomorrow, I would call the ranger. I took my fear, my flashlight, and my knife. Then I considered whether I should take my rifle, but I thought it would be fine. If someone was in the forest, they probably wouldn't come armed to steal someone's wood. No, my axe and my knife would be enough. But when I stepped outside, that coldness overcame me again. This time it was worse. It felt like icy sludge was flowing through my body. I glanced at the thermometer. It had dropped from 60 degrees to 20 degrees Fahrenheit in the time it took me to go inside and get ready. I needed 10 minutes to reach a spot. It was a small clearing. There were about 15 tree stumps there, and it was a good place to gather wood. Since the cabin had been built, we had been getting it from there. There was a tree that I had already cut down earlier, but I hadn't chopped it into smaller pieces yet. I didn't need much for the night, but when I started chopping, I got colder and colder. I was shaking violently and could barely hold the axe. It started slowly. I didn't notice it at first, but as it came closer, grew louder. It pierced through the steady thud of my axe hitting the tree. A growl, if one could even call it that. It sounded broken, like a smoker clearing their throat, mixed with a wolf. I looked up and expected to see a wolf, maybe a sick one or something, but it wasn't a wolf. At least not entirely. He stood on his hind legs. His body was wolf-like enough, though slightly human. He was incredibly thin. I could count every one of his ribs, even through his thick fur. Its color was strange. To say that it was dark black would simply not do it justice. How black it was, the little moonlight that fell on it seemed to absorb, and even the light from my flashlight. And his eyes. It had none, just 2 gaping black holes the size of golf balls where eyes should have been. And those holes, when his fur was black, they almost seemed to glow. They reminded me of black holes, how they absorb everything, even the light itself. They seemed to stare right through me. He stood about 10 feet away, arms hanging at his sides, panting. Incredibly calm for something that looked like it would tear me to pieces in seconds. I stood upright. I wasn't sure what I should do either. While I stared at it, I became colder and colder. Slowly, as if it had just awakened from a deep sleep, it opened its mouth, incredibly wide. It seemed to stretch across the entire head. I saw a mouth full of crocodile-like teeth, dripping with saliva and looking as if they could crush bones. Suddenly, it let out a terrible, unnatural scream and lunged at me. I jumped up and ran. Run, run, run. That was the only thought that went through my mind. I had to get away. That was obvious. But I only managed to take 2 steps when I suddenly felt a painful tug in my leg and fell. Then I turned around and saw that my foot was wedged between 2 rocks. I looked up. The thing was now in the air, hideous claws reaching for me. Its mouth seemed to open into a wide grin as it swooped down on me. At the last second, I rolled off and freed my leg with a painful twist, possibly with a crack, I don't know. I couldn't ignore the terrible screeching. Unfortunately, I wasn't fast enough, and its razor-sharp claws tore into my side as it landed next to me. I had expected to feel pain like fire, like one describes a stab wound, but it wasn't. It was cold, ice cold, like jumping into a lake in the middle of winter. It hit me like a shock and spread throughout my entire body. I gasped for air. The icy claws made it impossible to do anything else. But somehow, I focused so much on the cold that I was able to grab my knife and stab it into the back of the hideous creature that was trying to kill me. It roared in pain and rage as a dark, thick, blood-like substance oozed out and tore its claws from my side. Immediately, warmth returned to my body, though not completely. I got back up and started running. Every step sent unbearable pain through my legs. My ankle was severely sprained, and my foot probably broken. My side was strangely numb, but I knew I couldn't stop. So, I kept running. Then I glanced back, and I am not the least bit embarrassed to say that I wet myself right there. Only about 20 feet behind me, led by my first attacker, there was a whole pack of them, all unnaturally black, no eyes, mouths incredibly wide open. Somehow, I managed to run faster. My leg hurt, and I cried like a baby as I ran for my life. It felt like an eternity until I saw lights through the trees. My cabin. I let out a scream of relief and managed to run even faster. I burst out of the forest onto the clearing. At that moment, I was screaming like a madman. I ran up the stairs, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut with a loud bang. At that moment, I expected them to bang on the door and try to break in, but outside it remained eerily quiet. Immediately, I sank to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably and clutching my side. I was too worried about what I might find outside if I looked out. I was also scared to death. I didn't know what those things were, and I didn't want to know. In that moment, I just wanted to curl up and die. I was so scared. I had no choice but to sit there and cry. After a while, I stood up shivering and peered outside. I couldn't see much. My car was out there, and the forest a bit further back. But I knew they were still there and waiting for me. I was also sure that I could see them running around at the edge of the forest. So I wouldn't leave this cabin just yet. Only a few hours later would I dress warmly and fight my way through the cold, fireless night. And in the morning, I would go to my car and never come back here again. That was my plan anyway, but apparently not theirs. In the rooms, glass shattered. I had closed the doors to the rooms to keep the warmth in the living room and the kitchen. These doors flew open now. One flew off its hinges and through the room. I wasted no time. I had to get out. Quickly, I ran out the front door and slammed it behind me in a feeble attempt to stop them. I ran full speed towards the car. The pain in my leg was just a distant ache in my head. In that moment, I could hear them moving in the forest. This terrible growl seemed to come from all around me. After what felt like an eternity, but in reality only lasted a few seconds, I reached the car, grabbed the handle, and almost cried with relief when it opened. I jumped in, slammed the central locking shut, and patted my thighs to find my keys. My keys! I had left my keys on the kitchen counter. Instinctively, I looked back at the house. My breath caught. Around the windows, these beings crowded and stared at me. That was all they did. They stared at me too. They reminded me of children looking through the window of a candy store, gazing longingly at the goods. At the same time, I felt a kind of euphoria. I had taken a course in automotive technology at school. One of the many things I learned there was how to short-circuit a car. I pushed my seat back and leaned forward to remove the plastic cover. Then I threw it over my shoulder and started fiddling with the cables when something hit my car with a loud bang and shook it. I shot up and screamed. They had left the house and were now all around my car. Some walked upright, others crawled on all fours. One was even on the roof. I screamed as one to my right suddenly dashed forward and smashed the window on the driver's side. I bent down again, found the 2 wires I needed, and tried to make them spark. Above my head, 2 more bangs echoed. I was afraid to look up. The knocking was now coming from everywhere. My car rocked as they continued to pound on it from all sides. I could hear the crack in my window getting bigger. The car suddenly roared to life, and I sat up just as my window gave way. It shattered and enveloped me in shards of glass. The animal lunged at me again, but I moved. I drove over the small clearing around the cabin. As I approached the forest, I struggled to steer the car back onto the road. I managed a tight turn and came to a stop. Then I saw the pack charging towards me. For the first time that night, I felt anger. I stepped on the gas and drove onto the street. They chased me, growling and screeching. A particularly ambitious animal jumped in front of me, landed with a dull thud on my hood, rolled over my roof, and fell off the back. The rest slunk away growling, and I left the cabin behind. That was 2 hours ago. I stopped right at the foot of the mountain to record this and to rest as much as I can. I don't know what to do. I could call the police, but I doubt they would believe me. My ankle is bleeding, however. After the adrenaline left my body, the pain returned with full force. I drive to the hospital, then I call my family, and then, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know what to do, but I have to keep going. I still feel this terrible cold. I believe they're still nearby. We found Oliver's body today. After the second week, we had waited. He said, at most 3 weeks, but he also said that he would call if he decided to stay for 3 weeks. When he didn't call, we didn't think much of it. We thought he was too busy to call. When the 4th week passed, we started to worry. At the end of the 5th week, I decided to look for him. Everyone wanted to come along, but I couldn't take them with me. As the eldest brother and closest confidant of Oliver, I felt responsible for it. Oliver was probably just fooling around, but if something had happened, I didn't want the others to find out. So I set off alone. I drove to Wyoming and contacted the ranger in the area. He contacted some paramedics in case Oliver was injured, and we drove there. When we arrived, everything seemed to be fine. His car was still there, locked, just as he always left it. The cabin seemed untouched, except for a few hot dog wrappers. All the windows were closed, as were the bedroom doors. The fire pit outside looked untouched. I walked around the cabin while the ranger went a bit into the forest to look for clues about Oliver's whereabouts. The surroundings looked normal, except for the pile of firewood that we always kept outside. He was neat, except for a small pile of fresh wood on it, which I assumed Oliver had cut. When neither I nor the ranger found anything, we all went deeper in. After a while, we came across a deer carcass. At first glance, it was clear that animals had gnawed on it. Upon closer inspection, however, it became clear that it was a hunt. A small hole, probably from Oliver's rifle, was in his neck, and he had clearly been gutted with a knife. But no sign of Oliver. 3 hours later, we found him. He lay face down in the snow, near the small clearing where we had gathered wood. His left foot was wedged at a painful-looking angle between 2 rocks, and his knife was embedded in his ribs. He must have stumbled and fallen on the knife. His left hand clutched something, and his other hand was stuck in his jacket pocket. I was strangely dazed, and I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. I couldn't even cry. I pulled his right hand out and found it wrapped around his phone. So I unlocked it and was amazed that it still worked. It was opened on an audio recording. As we huddled around my brother and listened, I couldn't help but feel scared by the crazy story he was telling. After it was over, we sat in silence until one of the paramedics spoke. "The cold," he whispered. I turned to him. "What did you say?" His tone had something unsettling about it. "The cold," he said again, this time louder. "The cold makes you see crazy things. I have heard such stories before, and strangely, the things I have heard are sometimes eerily similar to what this boy described. But it's all in his own head. On a certain level, the body knows that it's over, that there's no way out, and sometimes it starts to see and feel things to cope with it. To make it easier to understand, I think he said he felt a strange coldness. That was the onset of hypothermia. But what about everything else?" I asked angrily. "What about the cold he felt before?" or the forest, the deer, or the... Listen, he said. You saw it yourself. There is nothing up here. Maybe your brother took something. My brother doesn't do drugs. He is too smart for that. The paramedic just shrugged. I turned back to the lifeless body. I was incredibly sad. There lay my brother, my best friend, dead. He deserved something better. He had had a good life. He had a loving girlfriend, a good job. Everyone liked him. He deserved something better. That's when the tears began to flow. After we brought his body down the mountain and to a morgue, I checked into a hotel and called my family to deliver the terrible news. We all cried, especially my mother. He had really been her favorite. They were now on their way to bring Oliver home. But I had something to take care of. I locked myself in my room with my laptop because I had to see what I could find. My brother was neither crazy nor addicted to drugs. Something about the whole thing didn't add up. His voice had sounded good on the recording, but how could he speak clearly with a knife in his ribs? Why did it seem like he hadn't made an effort to return to the cabin, but instead preferred to record a strange story on his phone? What about the deer, the firewood, his car, or the cabin? My brother was more than qualified to survive in the forest, in some ways even more than my father. So how could that happen? I try to find out as much as possible. It's progressing slowly. There's a lot of material on the internet, some of which are most likely crazy stories. With others, I'm not so sure. In a few hours, my family will be here. Maybe we can figure it out together. But as I rub the grainy feeling from my eyes, I pause and look out the window. The only available room was a room on the 4th floor with an unobstructed view of the mountain. Cruelly. And as I stare at the dark figure looming over me, the one that cost my little brother his life, I feel a cold shiver run through my body.